About the death penalty.
Do you know who Stanislovas Butkaitis was? No, he wasn't a member of parliament, and not a pop singer either. Yes, he was from Vilnius. Need a hint? Here you go. Well, he lived 500 years ago. So, Stanislovas was living a happy and carefree life. He was a nobleman and had 3 brothers, and everything was going along just fine until one day he had an argument with one of his brothers. He got so angry that he eventually killed him. Now, in pagan Lithuania, nobody could have been too worried. Some Madvildas killed your father. Just wait around the corner for Madvildas to plunge a knife between his ribs. I might be exaggerating, but for ancient Lithuanians, blood revenge was a matter of course. But now it was the early 16th century. A murderer had to stand before the court. Stanislovas was a nobleman, so his trial was attended by the Grand Duke himself, Alexander Jagellon, and the court sat at the palace of the Grand Dukes. The evidence was clear, so the decision was quick. Stanislovas was guilty. The penalty? Beheading. And where do you think beheadings took place in Vilnius? In the city hall square, more or less where they raise the Christmas tree nowadays. Sometimes they'd build an enormous pyre there and burn special criminals, like those who dared forge the Grand Duke's official documents. So, immediately after the trial, Stanislovas had to march to City Hall Square, accompanied by his brothers and a Vish, an officer of the court who made sure that everything happened according to the law. A large crowd gathered, with many nobles present. The Vish was content. You see, back then, if a nobleman's execution was observed by other nobles, it meant that everything was absolutely just and legitimate. Interestingly, as he walked to be executed, Stanislovas still wore a sword on his belt. This was one of the most important symbols any nobleman could display. But once he reached City Hall Square, he had to surrender his sword. To make things worse, the Vish also ordered that he be stripped of his hat, outer clothing, and shoes. Who do you think had the most to benefit? The executioner, of course, since he could claim any and all gold objects. Sometimes executioners got really lucky, like when, after beheading one of the Duke's servants, the executioner found 18 Polish zlotys in the man's shoe. That's about 2,000 euros today. But back to Stanislovas. He stood there, barefoot, clad only in a burlap shirt, and he had one request: to be allowed to say confession before death. The Vish agreed, so the man walked over to the Bernardine monastery, followed by a crowd of dimwits. Stanislovas was a clever man, you see. He knew that confession was his last chance at salvation. So, after confession, several monks approached the Vish and Stanislovas' brothers and begged them, "Have mercy on Stanislovas!" And can you believe it? His brothers forgave him. One of them, Kasparas, later remembered that moment. "We consulted with brother Venceslas and decided not to surrender Stanislovas to his death, but instead to release him so he might atone for his sin." Imagine the colourful words that came out of the executioner's mouth when he found out the sentence had been annulled. So much for sharpening his two-handed sword. And, more importantly, Stanislovas returned and took back his own sword, clothing and shoes. Such was the happy ending to the story of Stasis.